Hello, welcome to Writer's Reading. I'm Ernestine Meade. I'm going to read to you today from my book called Down Mare Creek Road. The name of the poem is I Haven't Got a Dime. This is kind of light. I may not write as often as you wish that I would write. I may not call at all, not even when rates are down at night. But don't you know I'd love to hear your voice on that old phone? And don't you know I'd love to entertain you in my home? The best that I can do right now is write for you this rhyme. I wish that I could mail it, but I haven't got a dime, let alone 29 cents. Maybe a carrier pigeon will land on my fence. Hey, I could send it COD. Would you pay for a poem from me? At least I'm thinking of you. That's about all I can afford to do. I wrote this poem to a friend of mine in Texas when she was wanting me to call her all the time. She was calling me and I couldn't afford to call her, so I wrote this poem to her. Her name was Debbie Armenter. Today, as my special guest, I'd like to introduce Candy Knudson. Candy, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Candy is a student at Pikeville College, and let's talk a little bit about Pikeville College. Why are you going to Pikeville College?
Well, my husband accepted a teaching position as a computer science professor in the fall of '91, and I thought that was a good time for me to come back to school. My background is that of being first a mom at home with 3 children, and I'm also a registered nurse. I did that for a while, and when Don accepted the job at Pikeville College, then I came back for the liberal arts education that I've always wanted, and I've been very happy there.
Well, that's good. What are you majoring in?
I'm majoring in English. I'm working on a bachelor's degree and hope to finish in May. And my special interest, I guess, is creative writing. But all of the courses have been good courses, and I'm having a good time.
So you're proud of Pikeville College, I take it, since you go there and your husband teaches there?
Well, Pikeville College is a small community, and I can't speak for all of the programs, but the English program is excellent, and the faculty are wonderful. They're very affirming outside of class, not just in class, and they're good teachers and good people.
Mm-hmm. Well, I graduated from Pikeville College in 1974, and I loved it. And I would recommend Pikeville College to anyone who's going to college. Because, like you said, it is a small community. I think you get to know the people more, you get to know the teachers more, and it's just a great school, I think. But let's talk a little bit about your writing. How long have you been writing, Candy?
Oh, that's an interesting question. When I took a creative writing course from Dr. Riley in the spring of '92, he asked if I'd ever written poetry before. And I'd always thought of poetry as something that had meter and rhyme, and I don't write that kind of work. What I write, I'd always thought of as formal thoughts, and the trend in poetry, at least for some years, has been what they call free verse. It doesn't rhyme, and it isn't of specified line length, so I guess I've been doing that without realizing it for most of my adult life. I find that when I'm particularly troubled about something, in order to put it into a way that I can deal with it, I have to define what's bothering me first.
Mm-hmm. Well, we had another guest on the show once who said that he didn't call his poetry, he called it short stories, because he just said what he felt, but it was poetry. But he was like you, it was free verse. And, well, I write some free verse, but I'm mostly into, as you could tell by my poems, rhyme. And it's just the way the way I do. But I love free verse. Do you want to read something?
Sure. The first poem that I'll read is called The Visit. It was written about a visit, the last visit I made to my grandmother before she died in 1987. And it was a hard visit to make because she was senile and she didn't remember us anymore. And it's really hard to see people you love in that kind of a condition. Anyway, this is called The Visit. I paused before the heavy door, its handle a stone. Inside, cleaning solutions fail to mask the stale perspiration of self-neglect. Windows never open. The distant voice of a man calls, "Won't someone please help me?" A nurse scurries down the maze of corridors. From the open door of Grandma's room, I watch her, picking some invisible thing off her lap robe, folding, unfolding, refolding her sweater, smoothing her dress about her vanishing form. Like dress clothes seldom worn, my words don't fit my mood. "Grandma, it's good to see you." "Me? Your grandma?" Looking past me, she points at the cars in the lot. "The cows are out." She curses in Finn and shakes her fist. Tugging at her safety restraint, her voice rises. "I'm stuck." I ask if she wants help to use the bathroom. "No, I have to cook supper for the men." "Where is that Carl, anyway?" With the back of my hand, I swipe at the hot stream coursing down my cheek and remember the long procession of cars that wound its way over rutted dirt roads to the small cemetery. It was a clear day, the January sun cold. Pained and puzzled, Grandma rubs her wrinkled, misshapen fingers. I reach for her hands, study the swollen joints. Her head bobs and her eyelids close. While she sleeps, I remember her kneading bread dough and cinnamon rolls, arranging my wispy hair in thin braids, touching my hot forehead with the back of her cool hand. Waking, she sweeps the hair from her face with a familiar gesture. Impulsively kissing her cheek, I speak softly into her ear. "Oh, Grandma, I'm going to miss you." Recognizing me, she exclaims, "Why, when did you come? You're not leaving already."
You have a way of painting a picture with your poetry.
Well, it's an interesting thing. In the creative writing course that I took from Dr. Riley, one of the first things he said to our class was, as he picked up a blank sheet of paper, that our job was to paint a picture on the paper with our words. And that really left an impression on me.
Dr. Riley was on our show a while back. He was very good. He read some from his novel. It's real good. He was an interesting guest. You talked about your grandmother cursing in Finn.
I'm of Finnish heritage.
Oh.
My grandmother's parents came from Finland about the turn of the century, so there's still little remnants of Finnish that I'm familiar with, I guess. In fact, this next poem that I'd like to read has a few Finnish words in it, which I think I will define before the poem.
Okay.
The poem is called 5 Generations of Homeless Women, and it was written because of a hard time my daughter was going through. I realized that prejudice is common throughout the world, and Laurel had run into some people who felt it was inappropriate for her to have a black friend, and she was very upset. But in this poem, the words iso iso äiti mean great-grandmother, iso äiti is grandmother, äiti means mother, minun pikku tytö means my little girl, and sisu is a real interesting word. It's a word that means stubborn determination, but more than that, it's also bravery and strength, and there's really not an English word that says everything it needs to say. But this is 5 generations of homeless women. Iso iso äiti, such sisu you possessed not to marry the drunkard, despite the child. Standing on deck, did you weep when land eluded view? Even 80 years after your voyage, Aunt Manda's whispers voiced no shame, only respect, empathetic reverence. At night, Aita used to stand at the kitchen window, looking out into the dark, crying. There were no near neighbors, no lights like in the home country. The small white house looked pale and tired with its peeling paint and sagging roof. Isu Aiti looked at me as if regarding a stranger. She chatted pleasantly, distantly, often incoherently, all company talk. Sitting on a chrome kitchen chair, she dangled her short legs, giggled like a little girl. After a while, she fell silent, sighed, then whispered, "When are we going home?" Agee's voice had a despairing edge. I feel like a prisoner in my own home. It's like living under a black cloud. Nothing I do, nothing I say is ever quite right. Apparently I'm not entitled to thoughts and ambitions of my own. I really don't want to hurt anyone, but I can't live here anymore. Not like this. With artfully affected detachment and averted gaze, he spoke to me. Contracts came out today. Everyone was renewed except me. 10 years of deeply rooted ties sheared off with a single breath. The children's shrill questions echoed my covert panic. "But Mom, where will we live? Where will we go?" "I don't know. I don't know." Tears pooled in her dough-brown eyes. "What's wrong?" I asked. "Nothing. Everything. Tell me." A deep breath, then, "Melissa said you don't belong here, you nigger lover. Why don't you go home?" And I thought she was my friend. The long damn tears spilled, and Minnan Bikujutu pleaded, "Please, Mom, please, can we go home?"
We wrote a lot into a few words, didn't we?
Well, it was interesting. When my youngest son read this poem, he said, "That's not a poem, that's a short story."
Yeah. Well, it's kind of true. I saw that poem before. It won an award or something, didn't it?
It won the Auxerre Award this past spring. I felt very honored.
Yeah, I remember seeing it in the newspaper, and I read it, and I didn't really understand it completely, but I kind of got the gist of it. But I knew then it was very good, and I'm glad I got to meet you. I didn't realize when you were coming to the show that you were the one who had written that poem.
Oh, thank you. Each stanza of this poem is a generation, represents the generation. And I guess I was dealing with the idea that in everyone's life there's some place where you don't quite fit. And we can't always help our children fit either. It's a struggle. And when my daughter's tears were in her eyes, this is the result, mainly of that episode.
You know, that's where poetry mostly comes from something that is bad, and then something good comes out of it because you write something beautiful like that. Or you write very sophisticated poetry.
Well, I guess that feels like flattery to me. I just write what comes. I don't feel like I write it as much as I'm a medium. I don't mean to sound occult or anything, but I'm the tool.
Yeah, I know what you mean. But you do a good job of putting it together. I mean, I know the thoughts are there, but you put them together.
Well, it's a way to deal with frustration sometimes with joy. But I guess being the kind of people that we are, it's usually the difficult times that really we remember for a long time.
Mm-hmm. And the things that we need to write about. If I'm happy, I don't need to write about it. I'm just happy, But when you're sad and something's troubling you, if you write it down, then you feel better, I think. And it helps you to figure out things sometimes, too. If you're having a problem, something you need to work on, if you write it down, it seems to help.
That's really true. In my work as a nurse, one of the tenets, you might say, of nursing practice is that to make anxiety or fear something you can deal with, you need to define it first. Mm-hmm. And I guess that's what poetry particularly does for me. It helps me define what bothers me.
Yeah. Writing is important in other ways than just creative writing. When we have goals, everybody says if you have a goal, write it down so that you can look at it and read it again. Put it on your refrigerator. And I think that's why we have New Year's resolutions that we write down, so that we can go back in June and look at it and see if we have really done what we resolved to do. So I think sometimes people think about writing as purely creative, and it's not. I think there are important writings that are not really what we would call creative.
I think that's one of the interesting things about writing is that there's so much power in it. You'd asked earlier what brought me to writing, and it sounds maybe kind of funny, but several years ago I heard a folk song, and just the snatch of part of the song, and I don't even remember who wrote it, but part of the song said that I believe the final fight will, some believe the final fight will be won with greatest might, but weapons aren't what makes us strong. I believe that they are wrong, so I lift my voice high and clear, so they'll know that I am here. For if we do not stand and fight, I believe that they'll be right. And I guess I see words as a communication tool, and communication is the power that can resolve conflict if we avail ourselves of the tool.
Right.
And develop the tool.
And, you know, communication and being able to communicate comes from education. And I think, you know, you're going to Patton College now to get, well, maybe not, I don't know that it would be a better education, you know, because you're a nurse, you know.
Well, it's a more complete education. I think.
And a different kind of education, and especially with your writing. That will certainly help you to communicate better and stand and fight.
Stand and fight.
Well, what else do you have to read for us?
Well, this next poem is called Sisters. And the first year that we lived in Pikeville, we rented a house on Harold's Branch. And one day, I don't remember why, but I walked home from the college, and I was just struck by the beauty of the hills in the afternoon, and just so much symbolism that nature has for other ideas. And this one is called Sisters. The afternoon wind, warm with effort, flustered with hurry, swept through the hollow as if late for an appointment. Long blades made way for her passage. Dandelions sent soft whispers of concern. Birds and greening leaves gossiped noisily about her destination. A pair of butterflies, like black and yellow blossoms freed from bondage to the soil, were intent on the rhythm of their aerial dance, oblivious of the creek, murmuring to mossy stones about how far she had to go and how much she had to do before night covered Earth's children with the blanket of darkness.
Another picture. You're not from Finland, and you're not from Pikeville. Where are you from?
We are from Wisconsin. I was actually born in Minnesota, but my husband was born in Wisconsin. And we've lived most of our married life there, except Don went to the college in Bowling Green, Kentucky, for his master's degree several years ago. And we liked Kentucky, and when we had the opportunity to come back, it didn't seem like a strange place we were coming to.
You're married?
I'm married.
And you have children?
I have 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. My youngest boy is 14, my daughter's 17, and my oldest boy is 19.
And what are their names?
Our youngest is Kyle. He's a freshman at Pikeville High School. My daughter is Laurel, and she'll be starting college at the University of Wisconsin in January, and she's in Wisconsin now. And my oldest son is a sophomore at Eckerd College in St. Petersburg, Florida. So we're scattered all over the place right now.
You're going to have 3 of you in college at the same time?
This is pure insanity, but that's what's happening.
Expensive, too. But that's great. You know, it'd be nice to be in college with your kids. You can all be learning at the same time. What are your personal plans with your writing?
Well, right now I've been looking through several brochures for graduate schools, and I'm pretty sure that I'll go on to graduate school for a master's degree and possibly a PhD eventually, but I'd like to teach in a college or technical school and also be able to continue writing. I've never really thought much about publishing or how you go about it, and I've had a few people kind of pushing me. You need to do more of this. So.
You need to, because you're very good, and people need to know that. You know, if you write, I used to do that. I used to write it and hide it somewhere, you know, because I didn't want anybody to see it, because it's kind of, you know, like we were talking about on another show, it's kind of hard to open yourself up and tell what you think, because you think people are going to ridicule you or think it's stupid or whatever. But, you know, if you have something important to write, I think it's important for people to read it or hear it like we're doing now. At least people are going to hear it, whether you get it published or not. But I think you will, because you're too good not to.
Well,
really.
thank you. You're very kind.
No, I'm not being kind. I really like it. I think you do a great job. It's so. The only word I can think of is sophisticated, and I don't mean that word, because the word sophisticated to me means worldly, and it's not worldly. It's, you know, it's very down to earth and spiritual instead of worldly. But I guess the word I mean is it's high. It's just, yeah. I don't know. I don't know what I'm trying to say. I like it. It's good.
Well, thank you. I wrote this poem called Homesick in the first fall that we were here. It was a big change, like all changes are, a lot of disruption, and that had to come out too. In loose soil over cold stone they await gentle rains and warming rays, hoping showers come before root and stem, leaf and flower wither, losing the will to grow deep, to grasp hold of life possible. Initially I had written this with using the words uprooted from the riverbed, transplanted in the hills, and I think Dr. Riley was the one that suggested that that's too obvious.
Yeah. Yeah. So sometimes I guess poems are supposed to be kind of, you know, you have to guess exactly what it means.
Well, I guess I'm not a writer who believes in being obscure just to be obscure, but sometimes that's the effect that writing has.
Sometimes I do that on purpose, you know, for one reason or another. Possibly because I don't want people to know what I'm talking about. It's something that's too painful, and so I do it in a roundabout way so that I just have to guess. And I think that's what you've done there very well.
I'm going to share, actually this is a 3-part poem, but I'm only going to share the first part. And it really is one of the problems that I dealt with as a nurse, and it's called decisions. I feel like I should explain one word in here, cardex. For nurses, cardex is just a small card that gives real basic patient information and just tells some basic facts. I read the cardex a 3rd time. Patient, Leonard, room 936-2, age 79 years old, diagnoses, GI bleed, ventilator dependent, persistent vegetative state, status post-cardiac arrest, code status, full code. The charge nurse shook her head and told a grim history. Some years ago, Leonard had taken an overdose of medication and died, but modern technology and the state intervened. With rare emotion, her voice trailed off. A shame, isn't it? Urine, the color of tea, trickled into a collection bag. Like tar, a foul stool oozed. Indelible mahogany stains violated the white sheets. A plastic bag, half full of blood, webs of transparent tubing, swayed above the bed. Vacant eyes, fixed in a white mask, reflected frightening features of medical genius. Curled fingers, tightly drawn arms and legs were cold, unmalleable clay. Relentlessly, the washboard chest rose and fell while medical technology hissed.
You're not going to read all that for us?
I didn't even bring the other
Oh,
parts.
I wanted to hear it.
I think for me as a nurse, one of the problems that came up fairly often was the idea of when a person has died, do you do everything that you can to bring them back and keep them there, whether their mind is there or not? And who makes the decision for that? In this case, the man was a ward of the state, and he had just a lawyer for family, no family, but the lawyer acted on his behalf, and for whatever reason would not or could not make the decision to have the ventilator turned off. And so this man was physically there, but not there at all.
For how long?
It was a good long time. I don't recall in the months and days, that kind of thing, but it was a very long time. And that's a hard decision, I'm sure, for anybody to make.
It's a hard decision probably for a lot of reasons. People have religious reasons, and then I think sometimes people think, especially in family, think that, well, they'll get better, they'll come out of this, you know. That's real hard. I'd hate to be the one that had to make a decision like that.
I think it really brings up the importance of living wills and families talking about what would they want done in a certain situation. And families don't like to talk about that. I'm one of those too.
Yeah.
But it's important.
Yeah. Well, tell me about this. This is not the only thing you write. You write short stories too, right?
Well, I am just beginning to try my hand at fiction. I've written a couple of short stories, and I have an idea that I think might be actually bigger than a short story. I did bring my first attempt at short story to read today, and it's not that it's any masterpiece, but I think maybe people can realize that they have stories to tell, and making that attempt is important, a first step.
Okay, well, we don't have a whole lot of time left, so maybe we should get to that now.
Okay. This story is called Cheated. Ellen shivered and wrapped a paper gown closer about herself. Sitting on the examination table, she studied the sharp instruments gleaming in their containers on the counter. On the walls, charts describing developmental milestones advertised educational toys. Posters of perfect babies nestled against the breasts of young mothers advertised infant formula. A quick tap on the door was followed by Dr. Jensen's hurried entry. "The test is positive, Mrs. Anderson." His straight teeth were commercial white. "You should expect this baby to arrive around the middle of October." Helen had suspected for 2 months that the long-awaited baby was actually on the way, but during the 3rd month she began to bleed. She had told David it wasn't uncommon. At least that's what all of the experts said, and she had read everything she could get her hands on. Still, she was anxious, and David wasn't fooled. Actually, it was David who had made this appointment. The blue gown crackled as Ellen wrung her hands. Her voice quavered. "What about the bleeding?" "Spotting at this stage of pregnancy is fairly common, Ellen. After your last experience, I know you're concerned, but I really don't anticipate any complications this time." Ellen released a pent-up breath. Dr. Jensen rose from his chair. "You can get dressed now." At the door he paused, advising, "Call me if the bleeding doesn't stop within 4 or 5 days. 5 days later, Ellen tried to reach Dr. Jensen, but the receptionist put her off with a nasal, "Thursday is the doctor's day off. Would you like to leave a message?" Ellen could almost see her pinched, impatient face. Confused, she mumbled, "No, that's okay. It probably isn't anything to get excited about." David gently wiped her cheek with his fingertips and pushed an unruly, graying tendril from Ellen's face. "Why don't you go lie down? I'll take care of this kitchen." Lying down brought little relief for Helen's fears. The occasional twinges became regular waves, and severe cramping continued for a couple of hours. Then she passed what was more than a clot. Part of Ellen knew there would be no baby, yet she couldn't bring herself to believe what had happened. The waiting room was full the next day. Across the aisle from Ellen, a dark woman in a full smock greeted a young woman with plump cheeks and long blonde hair. "I see your little bundle finally arrived." Ellen quickly turned away and closed her eyes, but in her mind's eye was the indelible image of a similar pink blanket wrapped around a lifeless infant. In the center of the porcelain blue face was a nose like David's. Long, slender fingers, like Ellen's, would never grow warm. No one had been able to explain the intrauterine death. She'd appeared perfect in every way. Ellen had held her like a rare china doll, briefly, only once, and not by herself. Leaving the hospital with empty arms had been even more painful than the labor and silent delivery. "Are you sure?" Ellen pleaded, when Dr. Jensen made his diagnosis. "Incomplete miscarriage. You'll need a D&C. There's still a lot of tissue left." Ellen cringed at the awful word. "I'm sorry," he finished lamely. David gently led Ellen out of the clinic and took her to the hospital. He answered all the impersonal questions of the stone-faced admissions clerk, while a white uniform led Ellen down a long corridor to OB. The tiles glinted in the harsh light, and the corridor smelled of antiseptic. Mutely she followed the nurse to a room on the far end of the ward. The nurse looked ashamed. "We had to put you here because med-surg is full." "It doesn't matter," Ellen whispered. But when the baby's cries pierced the hospital's quiet, the wound tore open again. Her empty arms ached. Dr. Jensen came in to explain the surgery and found Ellen in tears. His white coat flapped, creating a breeze in response to his rapid and forceful footsteps. She heard him speak to the admitting nurse at the end of the hall. Though Ellen couldn't make out the words, his voice was curt. Somehow room was made on another floor. That evening, a nurse came in with a surgery consent form. The operation was to be done early the next morning. She mechanically repeated the same things that Dr. Jensen had said, but concluded by saying, "After 35 minutes, it will be all over." All over, Ellen thought. "You're young. You can have more children." The nurse's attempt at comfort incensed her. Inwardly, Ellen raged. "No, you are young, and I wanted this baby," though she said nothing. The nurse left with an efficient rustle of skirts. Early the next morning, the surgeon came to Ellen's room. She couldn't look at him, realizing he was also the ogre who performed the abortions at that hospital. It didn't seem compatible, being one who healed people, and yet the same one who snuffed out lives before they even had a chance to start. Briskly he explained that surgery was necessary to prevent infection or possible hemorrhaging. Ellen's lack of response apparently irritated him, because he left with a frown. Ellen woke from anesthesia feeling nauseated. David's face was anxious. "How are you feeling?" "Not so good." Dr. Jensen came in. He regarded David and Ellen for a moment, and then said, "The surgery was routine, went very well. We'll just keep you here another day for observation, to make sure there aren't any complications." He opened his mouth and then shut it. He started to turn away, but stopped halfway through the turn and spoke his words carefully. "You're a healthy woman, Ellen, but I'm sure you realize that with increased age there is increased risk in pregnancy and childbirth. I'm not saying you can't have a child of your own, but I think it's appropriate for me to suggest the alternative of adoption to you. At least consider it, won't you?" David came for Ellen at 10 o'clock on Sunday morning. Easter Sunday morning. She couldn't bear the thought of going home to an empty house, so they made the half-hour drive to church. A brown stallion ran beside the country lane as if to throw off his matted winter coat. A flock of birds descended upon branches thick with the first buds of spring, but all Ellen could see was the recent snow that shrouded the pastures and sharp edge of ice that gripped the edges of the creek bed. David seemed to sense her need for solitude and didn't force conversation. Seated inside the church, Ellen didn't notice at first Johnson's daughter peeking at David from behind her mother's shoulder. Then a squeal of laughter broke into Ellen's private thoughts. She glanced up and saw David's wide grin. and Emily's pigtails bobbing with delight as David walked his fingers along the back of the pew toward Emily. Ellen's ears were deaf to the familiar hymns. Pastor Clark spoke of the joy of Easter and its promise of new life, while deep sorrow and suppressed anger threatened Ellen's previously unquestioning faith. She wondered what kind of perversity permitted God to punish her for wanting a child of their own to love. Outside the church, the March wind was no more bitter than she. She wanted to shake those smiling people who shook hands, stood in small groups, and visited in their finery. Their cheerful voices were irritating. Their idle chatter was intolerable. A group of young children played a chase game on the churchyard, where green blades refused to hide beneath a blanket of snow. There was a scuffle, and then chubby hands grabbed Ellen's coat, and a voice cried out, "Mommy!" Ellen caught her breath and looked down. A face regarded her with wide eyes, just for an instant, then disappeared. David asked, "Do you want to stay for the potluck?" "I can't," whispered Ellen. "Let's go home." Several days later, David came into the living room and opened the draperies. When he turned around, he saw Ellen sitting in the rocking chair. "You startled me. I didn't even know you were there. It was so quiet when I came in, I thought maybe you'd gone to Sandy's." Ellen looked at David and shook her head. "What are you doing, sitting here in the dark?" "Just thinking." "A penny for your thoughts." David's effort at being light received no response from Ellen. "Come on, Ellen, talk to me. You haven't said a word for 4 days." "What do you want to talk about?" "I don't know, just talk to me. I'm your husband, remember?" "I don't know what to say, David, except that I'm tired and I don't want to argue with you." Ellen got up and went into the den. She heard the front door slam and the crunch of tires on the drive. The phone rang. Ellen tried to ignore it, but after several rings she picked up the receiver. It was Sandy. After a brief and halting conversation, knowing Ellen hadn't been feeling well for some time, Sandy asked suspiciously, "You're not pregnant, are you?" Ellen replied dully, "No, I have to go." She hung up the phone and slid against the wall to the floor like a rag doll, wondering how much more punishment she could endure. Routine chores became impossible. She'd forget that she was doing dishes and would go fold half a basket of clothes. She'd find herself opening a cupboard door and wonder what she was doing there. She'd put water on for tea, only to have it boil completely dry. Ellen was sure she was losing her sanity. Desperately, she wrote to Dr. Jensen, asking why she miscarried. His return letter only stated that out of 7 or 8 similar cases, she was the only one who had miscarried, and it would take one more all-knowing than he to answer her questions. Lying in bed, Ellen reread his letter, looking for the answer that eluded her. She fell into a restless sleep and dreamed a horrible dream. Tenderly, David had given her a valuable pair of pearl earrings. She'd put them on with great pride and joy. Then it was night, and she was paralyzed by bone-chilling cold. A beast with white fur and gleaming teeth cornered her, and she was unable to escape. Sharp claws dug into her flesh, tore the earrings away from her. The flow of blood could not be stopped. She cried for her pearls, but they were gone. David's face was distorted as he shouted at her. "How could you lose my pearls? Have you no idea how priceless they were?" Soaked and trembling, Ellen sat up in bed and searched David's sleeping face. Beneath a shadow of beard, it was free of the deep lines evident during the day. She was suddenly convinced that David was unhappy with her. She wished she could die. Her pain would be gone, and David would be free. Spring gave way to summer, though she was unaware of the transition. The tears had stopped, but so had all feelings and emotion. One day would fade into the next. They were all alike. On their anniversary, Ellen heard David humming in the porch. When he came through the door, he held both hands behind his back. "In the mood for a little romancing?"
Excuse me, Katie. This is wonderful. I love it. How many more? Our time is almost up is the problem. How much longer is it?
I guess about 5 pages.
Okay, we'll try to read it for them. Maybe they won't get too mad at us if we get going a little over.
Ceremoniously, David brought his hands out from behind his back. In one was a bottle of wine, and in the other a bouquet of yellow roses. The sight of the roses brought back a vivid memory of a single yellow rose slipping off a tiny coffin during its descent into a deep black hole. Ellen never talked to anyone about that awful day. Usually she was able to convince herself that it had all been just a bad dream. But certain things brought reality in focus, with painful clarity, things like roses. Ellen slipped between the cool sheets and listened as David finished getting ready for bed. She could hear the water run and the door of the medicine cabinet squeak as he placed his cologne bottle back on the shelf. He slid into bed next to her and put his arms around her. Feeling awkward, she stiffened, the same way she did when distant relatives hugged her at reunions or at funerals. David's voice was controlled, but the edge of anger was sharp. "Don't you think 3 months is long enough to wait, Ellen? How long am I supposed to live like a monk?" She hated to hurt him, but it was easier to refuse. In August, they visited David's sister and her husband at their new home. Beth's husband, Paul, met them at the door with a glass in one hand. The odor of liquor was strong on his breath as he greeted Ellen and draped his arm across her shoulders. "Hey, doll, where have you been? Thought maybe you'd died or something." David looked as if he'd like to punch Paul, but he put on a polite mask and asked instead, "Where's my kid sister?" "Her Majesty is around here somewhere. Search the palace." A gifted architect when he was sober, Beth's husband had designed their home. It combined French Baroque style with the latest in domestic gadgetry. Beth's professional decorating skills were reflected in the sheen of highly polished furnishings, gilt mirrors, and marble floors. Showing them around, Beth was excited. "Look at this. Recognize it?" David looked at Ellen. Beth answered her own question. "It's a Louis XIV. What do you think?" Before them was an overly ornate piece of furniture. What its function might be, Ellen couldn't begin to guess. She only knew that whatever it was hideously overdone, but she kept her thoughts to herself. David spoke for both of them. "What is that monstrosity?" Beth rolled her eyes and said, "I'll have you know it's very rare and extremely valuable. If you weren't such a hopeless peasant, I'd be angry with you." Ellen remembered Beth's comment about the pine dresser that she had refinished for the nursery. "Well, I guess it might be worth refinishing as long as it's a family heirloom, but you know, even a century ago pine furniture was considered cheap." David had teased, "I'm glad the mother of my child won't be a snob like you, Beth." Ellen loved him for sticking up for her. Unlike Ellen, who had never had any other career ambition than to be a wife and mother, Beth had become well known in the field of interior decorating. She had met Paul at a cocktail party thrown by a mutual client. On the flowered terrace overlooking the bay, they ate brunch. Getting ready that morning, Ellen had told David that she could never say that word without feeling a little bit ridiculous. He laughed and shook his head. "You know Beth loves glitz and glory. Now me, just give me a pat on the head and a warm place to sleep, and I consider myself a lucky dog." Ellen wondered how siblings could be so different. The view of the bay from the terrace could have come out of an old movie. The water sparkled, and a lazy breeze teased the sails out on the water. The sun was pleasantly warm and brought a flush of pink to the pale skin that Ellen had hidden behind closed doors and drawn curtains for so long. Conversation was characteristically superficial. David and Beth were family, but had few common interests and concerns to talk about. Eventually, the subject of the family reunion came up. Casually, David's sister mentioned, "We won't be coming to the reunion. I've got a doctor's appointment." Paul interrupted. His speech was slurred and barely coherent. "Yeah, I was just poking fun, but she took me serious. Hope the little mistake is a boy." "Shut up, Paul. You're so disgusting when you drink." Beth's eyes were angry. Ellen looked at Beth and asked, "Are you pregnant?" Beth replied, "I'm afraid so, but maybe now is as good a time as any." You know, by a biological clock and all of that. Who knows? Maybe I'll add nurseries to my professional repertoire. Ellen looked out across the bay. In the distance, one lone sail retreated, becoming ever smaller until it faded into the horizon. Turning a pained expression toward David, she whispered, "Please, let's go home." He reached for her hand and made some excuse for their abrupt departure. The bed sagged as David sat on the edge. 2 thuds followed in quick succession. The springs groaned as he lay down. He asked hesitantly, "Ellen?" Facing the wall, she made no reply. David released a frustrated sigh. Ellen couldn't sleep. Her mind replayed the scene on the terrace. She felt both sorry for and jealous of Beth. In all of that luxury, she was stuck with a man who loved Jack Daniels more than he loved his wife. And given the most priceless treasure of all, she didn't seem to appreciate or even recognize its value. Next to her, David emanated powerful warmth. His scent was unsettling. Ellen remembered the feel of his hand over hers and his arm protectively around her on the way home. He was a rare man. "David?" Her voice was faint. He rose up on one elbow. "Ellen?" Turning toward him, she began to cry. David gathered her into his arms, and she lay her head on his chest. She thought about what an exceptional husband he was and about what a good father he would make. Listening to the steady rhythm of his heart, Ellen realized that empty arms had been her own choice, and that in her vanity of insisting on a child of their own, she had chosen empty arms for both of them. She whispered, "I'm so sorry." David kissed her hair and said, "It's going to be all right now."
That was wonderful. I loved it.
Well, it's my first ever short story attempt, so
It's
that's the
very
purpose
good.
of showing it.
Someday, it's my opinion, you will be famous as a writer. I think you're great. Really wonderful. I want to thank Candy Knudson from Pikeville for being on the show today.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. And I also want to thank Dr. Dawn and WPRG for allowing us to come to you. And until next time, may God bless you.